I think we're good. That is very sensitive, apparently. So, but anyway, yeah, welcome everybody to our October meeting. Thanks to everyone joining us here in Edinburgh, and we have a lot of people online as well. Getting kind of like a staticky feedback noise. I don't know where that's from. That's not on. It's on.
Maybe that's it.
So thanks everybody. Yeah, these national meetings are happening on the last Wednesday of every month, and it's an opportunity for our FOES members and supporters to come together and learn about key issues and campaigns and how we can all work to make a better world, basically. For those of us who don't know, I mean, most people will, but we're Friends Here Scotland. We are campaigning for a world where everyone can enjoy a healthy environment and a fair share of the Earth's resources. We call for a just transition from fossil fuels to 100% renewable, nuclear-free, zero fossil fuel Scotland. And we're part of the world's largest grassroots environmental federation. There's over 70 national members groups and millions of members across the world. We're member-led, and you can join for as little as £1 a month. And there's information at the back about membership. But we're here today to talk about fossil-free Parliament and fossil fuel lobbying in Holyrood and Westminster. Friends Here Scotland is part of Fossil Free Parliament and the Fossil Free Politics campaign with Friends Here Europe and other European groups, and we work together to investigate and challenge the influence of fossil fuel companies over our politics. So today, we're delighted to be joined by guest speakers. We have Paul Dobson from the Ferret, Juliet from Transparency International UK, and her colleague Rose will be joining us online, and Lewis Cohen-Rao from Fossil Free Parliament. Also, my colleague Sally will be joining us online as well to talk about a few different things, but we'll get to them. So when we talk about, I mean, fossil fuel lobbying is a big problem and a legitimate concern of ours. Lobbying can be a legitimate activity to share concerns with those in power. I mean, Friends of the Earth does a lot of lobbying. Constituents do a lot of lobbying, but we find that fossil fuel companies have an undue influence due to money and power. And we're here to talk about, to find out about fossil fuel influence over Westminster and Holyrood and how we can cut fossil fuels out of our politics. So we're going to start with this short little video that I will play for everybody.
No one needs to be told just how damaging fossil fuels have been to our planet, how many lives they've ruined, pumping out death, destruction, pumping more money, more power. Our politics is captured by these corporate interests, so the fossil fuel lobby will stop anything gets in the way, making them more money, climate action, social justice, respect for human rights. If it doesn't turn a profit, they don't want to know. So we need to cut fossil fuels out of our politics. And when we do, we'll finally have a space for the real ideas, bring in the real solutions that we all need. So long as our politicians align with the fossil fuel industry, there can be no justice, no clean air, no safe water, no climate action. So we need to come together across struggles to make sure these corporate interests get out of our way, to stop their business model killing our futures. We don't need their quick fixes, false solutions. We already have all the ideas we need. We just need to take a space, make them happen. History shows that when enough of us demand change, we get it. But if we don't, we take it. Join us so we can finally cut fossil fuels out of our politics, get justice for the people.
Thank you. So yeah, we're going to dig a little deeper into how the fossil fuel industry.
Now been looking for a job for a year.
Keep going. We're going to dig a little deeper into how fossil fuel industry is trying to capture politicians at Westminster and Holyrood, and discuss how we can take action to call on our MPs and MSPs to act in the interest of their constituents, not the profits of big fossil fuel polluters. So first we're hearing from my colleague, Sally Clark. Sally is a divestment campaigner at Friends of Scotland, and we'll be talking about why we need to kick polluters out of our politics. Sally's joining us online, so I think that they should be able to do that now.
Thank you so much, Malky.
Sally, you can't hear Sally.
Hi, thank you.
There we go.
I hope you can hear me okay. And if we could just move to the next slide. It's really lovely to be joining with you. Apologies in advance that my voice is a bit croaky. I'm afraid I've tested positive for COVID, which is why I can't be with you in person, but I'm so happy to be with you online, and thank you so much for coming tonight. As we've just seen in the video, and this is just the next slide, the oil and gas industry is using lobbying to prevent the vital phase out of fossil fuels that we need if we're to avoid the worst impacts of climate breakdown. You might have seen that last year, a staggering 1,770 fossil fuel lobbyists were at the UN COP29 climate talks. But these lobbyists also have their oily hands all over our politics here in the UK, both at Westminster and at the Scottish Parliament. But the good news is that by working together with groups here in Scotland and all around the world, we can help to kick fossil fuels out of our politics and call on our MPs and our MSPs to work for the good of people and the planet, not the profits of big polluters. And this is the key time for us to take action. And this is just the next slide. Just yesterday, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that we must change course now. He said, "It is clear that the era of fossil fuels is coming to an end. We are seeing a renewables revolution, and there will be no way in which humankind will be able to use the oil and gas already discovered." We all know what the lobbyists want. It's to increase their profits, with the price being paid by humankind. And as he warns, we are facing a climate emergency at the moment. We have just had the hottest year on record. And all around the world, we're seeing extreme weather devastating millions of lives, including the catastrophic Hurricane Melissa in the Caribbean right now. And it's the people who have done the least to cause the climate crisis who are already suffering the most. But we know, and our politicians know, what we need to do to address the climate emergency. The International Energy Agency confirmed in September this year there can be no new oil and gas projects if we're to keep global temperature rises below 1.5 degrees. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and support a just transition to renewables like wind and solar power to protect communities here in Scotland and across the globe to ensure we have a livable future for everyone. And then just the next slide, thank you. But far from being part of the climate solution, fossil fuel companies are what Antonio Guterres calls the godfathers of climate chaos. These companies like BP, Shell, and Exxon have known for decades about the harm they're doing to the planet. But what did they do? They hid their research, and they're doubling down on their core business model, the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. BP announced earlier this year that it's abandoning renewable energy projects, and Shell is currently planning 700 new oil and gas projects. Fossil fuel companies are also lobbying governments to delay and prevent climate action in Holyrood and Westminster. For example, and this is just the next slide, in 2023, the previous government met fossil fuel lobbyists every single working day. And these lobbyists successfully campaigned to water down the windfall tax on excess oil and gas profits. It just so happens it was the same year that the Conservative government issued huge numbers of new North Sea oil and gas licenses. In the words of former Vice President Al Gore, these companies are way better at capturing politicians than they are at capturing emissions. And speaking of capturing politicians, One key way that the fossil fuel industry is trying to influence policy is by promoting dangerous false solutions. And this is just the next slide, like carbon capture and storage. This is unproven technology, and new research by Influence Map has shown that there are currently no working examples of carbon capture in the UK. But the vast majority of meetings about carbon capture have been with big oil and gas companies like BP, Equinor, Shell. And it might be a little bit of a coincidence that the government's announcement last year of £22 billion in funding for carbon capture followed a surge in lobbying by fossil fuel companies. This lobbying is also happening in the Scottish Parliament. Friends of the Earth Scotland's research found that fossil fuel lobbyists had 790 meetings, and this is just the next slide, 790 meetings with MSPs between 2018 and 2023. And that included a meeting between Kate Forbes and Norwegian oil giant Equinor at the UN COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. And Equinor is the company that wants to develop the Rosebank oil field. These companies have been pushing a narrative that we need new gas, like the big plans that SSE has to build a huge new gas power station in Peterhead. And Scottish ministers have made statements supporting SSE's plans for gas power stations in Peterhead. But by highlighting this lobbying, we can stop the companies overpowering the voices of people and communities. And plans for new gas in Peterhead have been delayed by years, partly thanks to this pressure. And a key way we can challenge fossil fuel influence is by understanding the tactics that the industry is using to try and lobby politicians. So I'd like you to imagine for a few moments that you work for a big oil and gas company, and your record profits are being impacted by climate policies like the windfall tax or the government's pledge not to grant new oil and gas licenses. What tactics do you think you can use to influence politicians to benefit your company? If you're online, it'd be great if you'd like to pop any ideas in the chat, or if you're in the room, maybe have a quick chat for 2 minutes with your neighbour, and we'll see what ideas we can come up with.
Please take it away.
We've had a good suggestion from Alison online of lobbying. Can you think of any ways that the fossil fuel companies do the lobbying? Oh, lovely. Yeah, fancy breakfasts or lunch meetings to persuade MSPs to support the company. Excellent. Oh, cozy directorships. Lovely. And staff politicians, very good example. Fancy nights out, surveys showing people want to keep the lights on. These are all brilliant suggestions. Oh, very good. Claim oil workers will lose their jobs. And tickets to sporting occasions. Yes, nice. And scare tactics about redundancies. Very good. And Malachy, maybe if you've got any ideas from the room. Keep people in the dark about the potential of renewables. Excellent suggestion. Reduce imports if we drill our own. Very good. That is a current argument that's being used. And funding political parties like Reform. Really good idea. Okay, well, let's have maybe couple more suggestions. And are there any ideas from the room? Promote new technologies, very good. And the Scottish oil going to lower Scots fuel bills, very good. Lots of greenwashing happening. Fab. Well, let's have a look at some of these suggestions because you've had great ideas. So this is just the next slide. And as you've said, one of the key ways that these companies use to influence politicians is through political donations. So this is just the next slide. Thank you. For example, I think we had this suggestion in the chat. You may know Stephen Flynn, who's the Aberdeen MP and the leader of the SNP in Westminster. He had a VIP excursion to Wimbledon, courtesy of BP, and Scottish Labour accepted a £25,000 sponsorship donation from energy giant SSE, the company that wants to build the new gas power station in Peterhead. And these donations are not just going to Labour and the SNP. This is the next slide. They're also going to the Conservative Party. Now, they recently ditched their net zero commitments at the same time as receiving £250,000 from oil investors and climate deniers. And the Reform Party has been described as the political arm of the fossil fuel industry. Last year, almost half of Reform's donations came from fossil fuel investors and climate deniers. So this is a key way that fossil fuel companies seek to influence policy because they're not giving charitable donations. Another way they try and lobby is through events. And this is just the next slide. These companies will often sponsor conferences or organise events and have politicians on their panels to try and directly access policymakers. For example, sharing a panel with Equinor or BP recently hosted an event in the Scottish Parliament, or companies like SSE will sponsor political awards. And another thing that they're doing is using a very, very busy revolving door between fossil fuel jobs and government roles. And in August this year, the Foreign Office was threatened with legal action because of a work exchange scheme that they've set up to allow employees of the arms company BAE Systems and Shell to have diplomatic roles within the Foreign Office in London, and vice versa. They're allowing diplomats from the Foreign Office to work for these companies. And the former Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, said that this was to help champion the interests of these companies overseas. So when a fossil fuel lobbyist has a role in government or vice versa, the industry and government priorities start fusing together. And another major way that these companies are trying to influence politicians is through lobbying meetings. The fossil fuel industry is very skilled at snagging a seat or many seats at the table with ministers. And new research from Fossil Free Parliament has discovered that the new Labour government had a staggering 500 meetings with fossil fuel lobbyists in its first year in power. 85 meetings were with Energy Minister Michael Shanks, who's the Rutherglen MP, and 24 were with Ian Murray, who's the former Secretary of State for Scotland. BP, Shell and Equinor met ministers 100 times between them, and almost every meeting about the windfall tax included fossil fuel lobbyists. But by bringing this lobbying out of the shadows and into the light and showing what these companies are trying to do, we can start to challenge their influence and call on our politicians to reject fossil fuel lobbying. And I'm going to pass back to Malachy now, and we're going to hear more from Paul about what's happening in Scotland. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, so we're going to hear from Paul Dobson now. Paul is an investigative journalist at the Ferret. He's been doing research into who runs Scotland. He's going to talk a little bit about the fossil fuel industry and the tactics that they use to influence decision makers in Holyrood and Westminster, and why that is a problem for climate action. So, Paul, thank you.
The slides just come. Just click it. Sorry, I'll have to apologise for my slides. They're nowhere near as professional looking as Sally's. But yeah, so good evening, everyone, and thanks to Friends There Scotland for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm Paul Dobson. I'm a journalist with the Ferret, and in an independent member-owned newsroom based here in Scotland. In case you don't know anything about the Ferret, and I'm aware there might be some people in the room and online who don't, our work is all about power and holding influential people, businesses, and politicians to account. And what hopefully sets us a little bit apart from other newsrooms in Scotland is that our independence from advertisers and billionaire shareholders means we can sometimes ask the questions others can't. Questions about who really holds power in our small country and who runs Scotland. And often one of the answers to that question is the fossil fuel industry, as I'm sure many people in this room already know. It's one of the most influential forces in Scottish politics, not necessarily through scandal or straight up corruption, but through a quieter mix of access, relationships, and influence over what is seen as acceptable in the national debate, particularly over climate policy. Our very first investigation 10 years ago now, amazingly, was into fracking in the Central Belt, when there were plans to frack there, which I'm sure some of you remember. And since then, we've continued to track how oil and gas interests keep shaping decisions in Holyrood and beyond. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about how that influence works in practice, with some examples and observations we and others have made over the years. So the way the fossil fuel lobby operate here follows a similar playbook that's used all around the world. The goal is very simple, really. It's to make ongoing oil and gas extraction look sensible, responsible, and unavoidable even as the climate crisis deepens and the suffering it's causing increases as well. Scotland's version is smaller in scale than other global capitals like Washington or Brussels. There's probably less money, well, no, there's definitely less money sloshing around, but that means it's more personal and intimate. Money and resources still help to build influence, but it's also built through proximity and familiarity with those in power. Many of the same people who represent the oil industry also move in the same circles as our politicians, and sometimes tellingly, they play the same golf courses. Through our reporting, I think we've seen four main levers at work when it comes to fossil fuel lobbying here in Scotland. So that's access to decision makers, the revolving door between politics and industry, the exchange of money and hospitality, and also efforts to control the public narrative around energy and climate change. So the first lever is access, and that's very simple. It's basically just who gets in the room and how often. And under John Swann, what we found is that access for businesses has accelerated. I think that's potentially part of a drive to mend fences with the business community after that relationship was seen to deteriorate a little bit under Humza Yousaf. So earlier this year, as you can see in this table, we reported that in his first 9 months as First Minister, more than 10% of the lobbying of ministers under John Swann came from the energy industry, and that's more than any other sector. And two of the top 5 lobbyists overall were SSE and BP. SSE met ministers 13 times in 9 months, while BP met them 10 times. And that's important because during that same period, BP was rolling back its renewable energy targets and expanding oil and gas production. And at the same time, SSE, while building renewables across Scotland, was also promoting a new gas plant at Peterhead, presenting both sides of its business to ministers as part of the same clean future. Now, you might think that this is just a kind of neat statistic to help illustrate our point, but the frequency of these meetings does really matter. A study in the journal Nature found recently that repeated contact from lobbyists builds trust and shapes how policymakers view problems and how to solve them. In fact, interestingly, it found that repeated access to policymakers was actually a more effective strategy for changing policy in the long run than direct financial corruption. So when time-poor ministers keep hearing the same polished lines about energy security and an orderly transition, those ideas start to sound to them like common sense. So this is why access matters, because it basically decides whose version of the future is heard so often that it becomes the accepted one. Second lever I want to talk about is the revolving door. And that's just basically people moving between government, politics, public relations, and the oil and gas sector. So earlier this year, we did an investigation called Influence Games, which mapped dozens of these links between government and industry. And what that found was that many of Scotland's most active lobbying and communications firms are run by people who know the government from inside. And we also got to make these nice playing cards, which you can check out, kind of Pokemon style, which are for our favourite PR firms and favourite PR individuals. So I want to take one example, which is True North, which is an organisation based in Aberdeen. It was founded by a former Scottish Government Communications Director and Alex Salmon's former Chief Aide, so people who know the SNP inside out. But now it represents major oil and gas producers, including the likes of Shell and BP, and also works closely with the trade body Offshore Energies UK, which is basically the representative of the whole North Sea oil drilling industry, as well as Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce, which is the main business group in the Northeast. And basically what that's created is a tight pro-fossil fuel network in the Northeast that has repeated the same disciplined message over the last few years. And that message is that oil and gas are essential to a fair transition, that the North Sea can be greened through things like hydrogen, carbon capture, renewables, and that challenging that narrative risks jobs and energy security. And because it has these relationships with people in government, that means it's more effective and its message is listened to. And the revolving door swings both ways. It's not just people leaving government to go into industry roles. I'm not sure how many people in this room know this, but we revealed a couple of years ago that Energy Minister Gillian Martin spent almost a decade in crisis communications for oil and gas companies before entering politics. That experience doesn't disqualify her from that role, and I don't want to in any way question her integrity or say that that's impacting decisions she's making, but you'd imagine it could shape how favourably she sees the industry and the solutions it favours. The next lever I want to talk about is money, not in the sense of briefcases of cash passed in shadowy underground car parks like in the Watergate scandal or things like that, but in the quieter, more acceptable forms of political finance, donations, sponsorships, and hospitality. These are all legal parts of the political system, but they also shape who gets time with decision makers. Ahead of last year's Scottish Labour conference, for example, just a couple of months before Labour got into power, the Ferret revealed that the party hosted a £550 a ticket business forum attended by energy companies and their lobbyists. The point isn't that anybody broke rules, it's that paid for access gives some sectors regular, direct contact with ministers and advisors, while others are left outside the room because they can't afford to be there. And the same pattern appears in many other parties. The Scottish Conservatives have accepted large donations for years from an oil tycoon called Alistair Locke. They understandably faced accusations of cronyism when Locke was made the party's Scottish chairman last year. And perhaps coincidentally, they've started to echo more extreme rhetoric on oil and gas in recent years. Indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, the Scottish Party's secretary, Malcolm Offord, who's a member of the House of Lords and also a shadow energy minister, appeared at an event organised by the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which is Britain's main climate denial group. You might think that's just kind of classic of the Tories, but their viewpoint on this issue has definitely become more radical in recent years, and we can track that. And then there's hospitality. So this is dinners, receptions, and awards, evenings that create opportunities to build goodwill with policymakers. An example we reported on a couple of years ago was a plush private dinner in Aberdeen where executives from companies like BP and Shell were able to lobby then First Minister Humza Yousaf. And these are often quite regularly held by other groups, including True North. These comfortable settings build familiarity and goodwill. They also ensure that those with the deepest pockets get the most opportunities to make their case. And maybe politicians are a bit more amenable to their positions when they're sharing them over a glass of nice red wine. I also want to touch on how fossil fuel companies try to control the narrative around climate policy in Scotland. A great deal of how fossil fuel companies peddle influence isn't just through lobbying, but also through stories, the way companies present themselves and the futures they want us to imagine. The old arguments denying climate change or delaying action are less effective in Scotland these days than they were before. The message now is, yes, we must act, but we must do it our way. I think BP is a good example of this. We found that they spent about £60,000 on Facebook ads in Scotland over 3 months a couple of years ago, and that was more than almost any other advertiser in Scotland. The ads promoted its renewables work, which is now largely abandoned, and talked about a safe transition, while the company was still expanding fossil fuel production. Gas lobby groups in Scotland have gone further, funding academic studies that promoted hydrogen heating as a green alternative to natural gas, despite warnings from the UK Climate Change Committee that it would be costly and inefficient. Those studies then appeared in briefings and news stories as if they were neutral research. All of this shapes what's counted as green or realistic before policy is even drafted, and by the time ministers sit down to make decisions, the boundaries of the debate, what's considered affordable, what's considered sensible, have already been narrowed by years of careful narrative work. Just before I finish, I want to provide a few reflections on why this influence peddling is effective in Scotland, in my view, and kind of colleagues at the Ferret. I think one answer is capacity. It's quite boring, but Scotland's government is small. Ministers often handle several portfolios and have limited support from researchers and aides in comparison to other countries. So they often rely on information supplied by the industry itself. If you're a minister under pressure and a large company turns up with a glossy plan and data ready to go, it's quite hard not to pay attention. They make your job easier, basically. There's also a political balancing act in Scotland because the Scottish Government wants to be both pro-climate and pro-business, a difficult position in a country where oil and gas are still seen to underpin jobs, local economies and identity in some regions. As an example, we reported last year that the SNP had used inflated numbers when criticising Labour's plan for the oil and gas windfall tax during the election campaign. Basically, senior MSPs, including Kate Forbes, said the extension of the tax could cost 100,000 Scottish jobs, but there are actually only around 90,000 people employed in the sector in Scotland, something you'd think that a government of 20 years would learn at some point. And that number had just been circulated by business groups and had been accepted by the party verbatim. And that, I think, shows how power works here. In a small system, industry doesn't have just have access. It often provides the baseline facts on which policy is built and that need to be called out if policy is going to be built in a way that we think is more just. So in closing, when people ask who runs Scotland, it isn't BP or Shell sitting in the Cabinet Office. It's a network of access, relationships and assumptions that keeps them close enough to shape decisions and define what looks practical and reasonable. And our job at the Ferret is to make that network visible, to show with evidence how influence really works in Scotland, because understanding power is the first step to changing how it's used. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. And next, we're going to hear about how we can take action by doing our own research into the fossil fuel industry. I'm very excited to welcome Rose Whiffen and Juliet Swann from Transparency International UK. Rose Whiffen is a senior researcher at Transparency International UK, leading their work on political integrity and accountability at Westminster. I think Rose is joining us online. And Juliet Swann is the Nations and Regions Programme Manager for Transparency International UK. She's based in Edinburgh and responsible for delivering on their priorities in Scotland. So I will pass over. Thank you.
Because we are one person. Okay, go Rose.
I can now unmute myself, apparently. I've been given the power. Good evening, everyone. Sorry I can't be there in person. So Juliet, who is in the room, and I are from Transparency International UK, and we'll be explaining a bit more about those tactics that outside interests use, but also how you can actually find out about what outside interests are doing. So to introduce ourselves, Transparency International UK is an anti-corruption organisation, and we operate in countries across the world. And Juliet and I look specifically at corruption in the UK. So if we go to the next slide, Rick, and the next one. So we've heard a lot about lobbying so far this evening, and why it matters is that it can distort public policy outcomes, and it undermines trust as well. And if we just go to the next slide again. But it's not all doom and gloom, because when done transparently, it can reduce policy capture and ensure openness in policy decisions and encourage parliamentarians to hear from a wider range of voices when that concentration of voices is called out. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to run through some of the influencing tactics that outside interests use. And, we've heard already from Sally about this as well. But we're also crucially going to show you how you can actually uncover these tactics and where you need to be looking to uncover them. So I'm going to start with Westminster. And, using a similar exercise to Sally, I'm going to go through these different tactics on the screen now. And I do want you, to think about, which of these tactics you would use if you were an oil and gas multinational and you had limitless resources. And I want you to think about the level of transparency of these methods, how effective you think they are, and the resources needed. So keep those things in mind when I show you them. So firstly, just staying on this slide, there are donations to political parties and MPs. So donors may fund parties because they believe in them ideologically, which has been shown in some academic studies, but also they could be looking for a return on that investment, on that donation, through access and influence. But we can, however, follow the money because the Electoral Commission does publish donations in an accessible and analysable manner on their website. So it's downloadable on their website and it's really easy to use. It's just an Excel spreadsheet and you can, use a search filter and you can look for a particular MP or just a political party. You can look for a particular donor and you can try and find out who's donating to who's influencing who. So it's quite a transparent system in that regard. So next we have gifts and hospitality, which again, we've heard about tonight. Sally was mentioning the tickets to Wimbledon. But, these could be gifts or clothes, as we saw in the Giftgate debacle last year at the beginning of Labour's government. And as a result of that scandal, there is actually now a gifts and hospitality register at Westminster, but it's just for ministers though. And it's also published in a not entirely accessible manner. It's not that easy to analyse. So keeping that in mind. So next we have party conferences. So, a private company might buy a stall or simply attend. And in terms of transparency, this is a bit of a black box of what really goes on at party conferences. We might be able to find some scraps of information on social media or in conference handbooks, but it's a bit of a loophole in terms of who ministers are meeting and what really goes on there. So next are APPGs. So these are all party parliamentary groups which are similar to cross-party groups in Scotland, but these are Westminster specific. So they focus on specific content areas to build expertise and share knowledge and things like that. And if we go to the next slide. So at Westminster, there is a register of these APPGs, but it's a mere 880 pages of PDF document. So it's not that easy to navigate. But you'll see here the hydrogen APPG, and you can see the MPs that are the chairs. It's not that cross-party, this one. I think it's just Labour and Conservative. But you can also see who has sponsored this APPG, which is really interesting. So you can see there's a consultant lobbyist here, which is then backed in turn by private companies. And we don't exactly know how APPGs operate, but we see here one example where they write reports and they disseminate these reports as well. And you might be able to see in the fine print there of the report that it is again sponsored by these private companies. So similar to these academic studies we were hearing about earlier about the hydrogen heating, having this APPG branding gives it a bit of credibility as well. So in this area, we don't have a lot of transparency of what's going on, but we have these sort of basic rudimentary registers. So if we move on to the next tactic, so this is consultant lobbyists, and there is a consultant lobbyist register, but it is just a register of consultant lobbyists. And if we go to the next slide. So here we have the entry of the consultant lobbyist Medano and their clients. So I just did that by typing in Medano into the search function, and then I got this return. So it is quite easy to use in that regard. But you'll see here, we just have the clients, right? We actually don't have any information about what Medano did on behalf of these clients. There's no additional information here. Did they send emails, letters, WhatsApps? We really don't know, other than the fact that they did do one of those things, because otherwise they wouldn't have had to register them as a client. But that's all we know. And this is in stark contrast with a lot of lobbying registers around the world, which will have a lot more information. And in Scotland, you will see a lot more information on the lobbying register. So lastly, if we move on to the next slide, there's ministerial meetings at Westminster. So these can be found on the gov.uk website. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you what that looks like. So it's all one portal of the transparency returns of everything that government produces. So you have to sort of tailor on the left-hand side your filter functions. And then you'll find these returns, but you'll see it's quite fragmented because they're published per department, per quarter. So if you want to look at what one company like BP is doing over the whole year across all departments, you'd have to look into hundreds and hundreds of these different web pages, which leads me on to the next slide. However, we at Transparency International UK recognised this problem, and we created our own portal, which is much more accessible and interactive, and it has information, meetings for both UK and Scotland. And if we could play the video, hopefully this is going to work. Both online and in person, play the video. So here you can see I type in Rosebank, which is the subject of what the lobbying might be about. And you can see these lobbying returns that come up. And you can see that the type of purpose is shown. And there's quite a long description there because that's a Scottish meeting. But then if we compare that to a meeting at Westminster, a very scant description there. But with our tool, you can toggle between the UK, and you can see the meetings about Rosebank and Scotland. And you can search anything in that search bar. So I've searched a particular topic that I thought a meeting might be about, but you could also type in the lobbyist itself, or you could type in the parliamentarian you're interested. And as I said, you can toggle between UK and Scotland, as was shown there. So I'll talk about sort of improvements that are needed in Westminster. But before I go on to that, just reflecting on my original question, if you were a fossil fuel company, which of these tactics would you use? I think in terms of transparency, clearly there are some tactics which are more out in the open than others, which you might choose to go for. But it's sort of a trick question, because you will find that, your big players will be using all of these tactics. I mean, they have so much resources, they will be using all of these tactics. So to just go on to my last slide. So you would have maybe gleaned from my discussions about how accessible things were, what the kind of changes we need. So we need to collate all of those, you see those fragmented departmental returns I showed you. Those need to be collated into a single web page to make it more accessible and easy to use. you know, we as Transparency International UK shouldn't be having to create this open access portal in order to show these meetings. The government should be doing it themselves. And in that comparison I did between the Scottish meetings and the Westminster, there was a much larger description about the Scottish meeting. So we need that type of explicit description at the Westminster level as well. You know, the requirement of what policy and bills are discussed, which you find in a system like Canada as well. And then we also need to expand the lobbying register so that it's not just these consultant lobbyists, it's also in-house lobbyists as well. And, you know, more detail is needed in those registers. So I will now pass on to Juliet, and she will go through these tactics, but in Scotland.
Excellent. Thanks, Rose. So yes, what Rose didn't say when she talked about how open access pulls together all those like hundreds and hundreds of documents is that Rose does that. Rose goes into every single spreadsheet and then uploads it all into open access every quarter. So kudos to Rose for doing that for us. So yeah, I'm Juliet. I'm really happy to be here this evening. As Malachy said, I look after TI UK's work in Scotland, and I'm going to run through the transparency tools at Holyrood, so in comparable to what Rose just told us about Westminster. I did want to quickly say, because we've covered such a lot already this evening, and there's a lot that we aren't covering. So Sally mentioned donations, and at TI UK, we are in the middle of a campaign to strictly limit political donations through what's a forthcoming elections bill at Westminster. We do lots of really sexy work. And Paul has touched on the revolving door, which we could talk about a lot more. And we've also heard about the way oil and gas corporations use certain narratives to enforce their lobbying. And I do really recommend the work of Influence Map in that space. And it's something that we looked up a little bit in our publication Power Politics, which you can find on our website. But I'm going to cover what you can actually find out. So here's that slide looking at transparency tools again. And yeah, at Holyrood, a lot of them are very similar. So donations to Scottish parties are recorded on the Electoral Commission database in the same way as Rose mentioned. We also have ministerial meetings and gifts and hospitality recorded quarterly in arrears. They are published as an Excel spreadsheet with tabs for different aspects, meetings, gifts, travel, etc. And the detail is fairly limited, as you can see from this slide. This is a snapshot of Gillian Martin's meetings in June. As you can see, subject, hydropower. Thanks, Gillian. That's really helpful. Or you can also see that Gillian's staff are a little bit confused with some of these meetings because sometimes they get repeated or sort of the same meeting twice, but with slightly different subjects. It's very interesting. So you could submit an FOI request to see if there's more detail of the meetings, or you could look at the lobbying register. You'd think. Not every ministerial meeting will need to be in the lobbying register because meetings on request are exempt. So let's just look at a couple of these in more detail. So in this instance, I'd like to draw your attention to a few entries. So there's one down the bottom here where the minister, she went to speak at the Global Offshore Wind Conference, and then she went on a tour of the exhibition. It's nice to know. And then later on in the month, you can see here she met with Scottish Environment Link, and her very last meeting of the month was with Friends of the Earth Scotland. So that's nice to know as well. So I also have a quick video. So here we can see what happens when you try and cross-check that information in open access. So a little bit like Rose, I filtered it to Scotland. I typed in Gillian Martin for my search term, and I restricted it just to June so I could do a direct comparison. So what we'll see is that you narrow this down to, we saw there was quite a few meetings she had in June, right, on the Excel spreadsheet. In the lobbying register, there are 5. And you can see that the top 4 there are all, there are some from that Scottish Environment Link roundtable, and there's the one that Friends of the Earth Scotland had. Kudos, the exhibition tour, Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, whoever they are, they did actually put in that they'd met Gillian briefly during that exhibition tour. I'm quite sure it means that nobody else, talked to her about anything important during that little round of the exhibition. Of her other meetings, 58 of them in June could be described as lobbying and are also, as you can see, not in the lobbying register. Now, One of the other problems with the lobbying register is there's a bit of a time lag on it. There's like a 6-month period before you have to actually report them. So some of them may be on their way, but I do think many of them won't be, thanks to that meetings on request exemption. So back to tactics. Rose talked a little bit about APPGs at Westminster. Cross-party groups in Holyrood, I think, are less influential, and they're certainly less financially supported than APPGs. You can check them out using their individual pages on the Parliament website to see who the membership is, as well as agendas even, minutes and annual reports. That said, the record keeping is a little bit inconsistent. And when you review well-kept minutes, you can see that there are some influence activity happening. But guess what? Lobbying during a CPG meeting is exempt from the register. So if you were lobbying during a CPG, that's fine. You don't need to tell anybody about it. So it would be useful if those minutes were kept more consistently and in easier to access formats, or indeed if that exemption were reconsidered. On party conferences, certainly lobbying register should include meetings that lobbyists have at party conferences. And sometimes what we do and what you'll see some of the Ferret and other journalists doing as well is sort of looking at conference handbooks and social media posts as a cross-check and vice versa to see if people are reporting what they're getting up to. Paul mentioned that Scottish Labour business conference where Arden Strategies were one of the sponsors. And I actually had to email them and be like, hi, I was wondering, did you talk to Anas Sarwar about anything when you were hanging out with him? And they were like, oh yeah, wait a second. And they did finally put it into the lobbying register. I was like, thanks. Unlike Westminster, MSPs do have to report gifts and hospitality, as well as other financial interests like rental income. These are published again in a very accessible PDF every parliamentary year, or you can find details on each individual MSP's page. It's a little bit clunky, to say the least, with entries not in date order and some MSPs sharing details of gifts below the £300 threshold and some not. That said, to be honest, the most interesting entries are usually complimentary tickets to the rugby, which you can see a little example of that sort of thing here. This is a completely random selection. It's Daniel Johnson MSP's entry. MSPs also sometimes list random things like if they're a member of Amnesty International or Friends of the Earth Scotland. Nice to know. I did once see an MSP declaring they were a member of their own political party. I thought that was a little bit much. But as you can see, the big asset we have in Scotland is the lobbying register. So this should have details of any instances of lobbying between organisations who are covered by the register and any MSP, including ministers in that capacity, special advisors and the permanent secretary. The ability to see the detail of these instances of lobbying, so exactly who spoke to whom, when, where, and what they talked about, whether they are a backbench MSP or a minister, is unique to Scotland in the UK context. So we have more in common with Ireland and Canada than Westminster and Whitehall. And just to remind you, as of earlier this year, we've added those lobbying meetings to open access. Just another plug. We don't get commission or anything. We're just quite proud of it. The next series of slides I'm going to whiz through quite quickly. So again, just talking a little bit about how things could be better. So we do have a lobbying register and we like it a lot, but it could still be improved upon. It's now almost 10 years old. So one of the things we'd like to see reconsidered are types of communication. So traditional in-person meetings covered by the lobbying register, not a problem. That extends to video calls. If you turn your camera off, not so much. Phone calls don't count, nor emails, nor letters. So we would like consideration to be given to extending the definition of lobbying to include a minimum phone calls or off-camera video calls, and possibly emails and letters. And then this is my final slide. Some other improvements we'd like to see. It's been talked about like how much people might spend, not just on donations, but on hosting or sponsoring events, that kind of thing. So we think it would be useful to see how much is spent on lobbying activity. Other jurisdictions do this in different ways, including just good faith estimates. We also think that turnaround between meetings and reporting could be faster. I mentioned the 6-month time lag. International best practice is quarterly. I did do a quick analysis of entries to the lobbying register, and over half of them are submitted within 3 months. So it doesn't seem like too much of an ask to push that time up. And then, as I've alluded to, there are a number of exemptions, some reasonable and some a bit confusing. So there's work to be done there as well. And certainly many of those recommendations were included in the Standards Committee's post-legislative scrutiny report, try saying that 6 times fast, that was undertaken in 2021. So we're hopeful there'll be time to act on those recommendations in the next session. Watch that space, as they say. So I'm just going to share this one. There you are, it's a QR code you can scan to access open access. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose and Juliet. So our last speaker is Lewis Conan Rowe, who comes to us from Fossil Free Parliament team here in Scotland and has been doing research into fossil fuel lobbying of the Labour government in Westminster. So I'll hand over to Lewis. Thanks.
That's me. Hello, yes. So my name's Lewis and I'm a volunteer with Fossil Free Parliament. So we are a volunteer-run group aimed at the UK government, Westminster specifically, and trying to work on reducing and ultimately eliminating the influence of fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel interests over political decision-making in Parliament. So I suppose you've heard quite a lot about the scale of the problem and how you can find out what's going on. And I'm going to try and talk a bit more about what we can actually do to try and deal with the problem that we're facing. This is one of the things that actually makes me feel most optimistic about what we're able to do. So this is an extract from the UK government's own advice about how they should deal with the tobacco industry. So they say, there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the tobacco industry's interests and public health policy interests. Government officials should exercise caution during interactions with the tobacco industry in all cases. And that guidance then goes on to put in place like a really severe and strict list of ways that people should take extreme caution when dealing with the tobacco industry and how they should avoid taking meetings and they should avoid financial interests, they should avoid lobbying and all these things. Which I think is very interesting because if you were to take this quote and just replace tobacco industry with fossil fuel industry and replace public health policy with climate change policy, although you could keep public health policy in there as well because climate change is also a health issue, you would basically have a piece of advice, which is exactly what we're looking to achieve as a campaign. So what we're really asking for isn't that radical. It's completely in line with what the government already says you should do when interacting with the tobacco industry. So we really think that's a very interesting and useful precedent that sets the tone for what we're trying to do as a campaign. What we're trying to do feels radical in the context of how the UK Parliament currently works, but it's actually not that radical when you see it in the context of actually what's changed. Like it wasn't always the case that there were these blocks around interactions with the tobacco industry that happened because of campaigning efforts in the past. So the things that we're asking for are in line with that advice around interactions with the tobacco industry. And you can see they're responding to a lot of the issues that have already been mentioned previously today. So we want to block the money pipeline. So that's dealing with donations to MPs, to political parties, but it's also with those slightly more subtle, insidious things like gifts, those tickets to Wimbledon and so on, that also provide another way in for financial interests. We're asking MPs to reject the invitations. So that's not going and speaking at that fossil fuel industry event or that event that's sponsored by the fossil fuel industry. It's also about trying to prevent fossil fuel industry events taking place in the UK Parliament. We've been seeing quite a lot of breakfasts with BP and this kind of thing, which we think also offer an unfair way that the fossil fuel industry gets access to decision makers. We want to remove the seat at the table. So that's removing fossil fuel companies and their representatives from decision-making spaces, but also thinking about things like APPGs, which were mentioned already, meetings with ministers and all these ways that fossil fuel representatives get into Parliament. We want to divest the pension fund, so the personal pensions that are held by the pension fund for MPs, that still includes money invested in the fossil fuel industry. So we think this presents a bit of a conflict of interest where MPs' money is being invested in an industry where really they need to be taking decisions that are against the interests of that industry. And then finally, break the revolving door. So that's that issue that's been touched on a lot about people moving between jobs in the fossil fuel industry and the UK government. I think maybe the thing that's worth saying across all these asks is when we're talking about the fossil fuel industry, we mean the fossil fuel industry and their representatives. So often this work is not done directly. It might be someone directly from a fossil fuel company coming and speaking to an MP, but it might also be a network or industry group that fossil fuel companies are part of, or it might be a lobbying organization, or it might be a think tank that's aligned with fossil fuel industry interests. So we have to be quite careful about defining what that looks like, because a lot of it is a bit more subtle and hidden than simply Shell going in and saying, we want to talk to you. Often they're working through other methods. We are making a difference, and I'm just going to kind of list a few of the things that we've managed to do or that we're currently working on. So I think one thing that's quite current is working with Chris Packham and his team on a campaign around banning fossil fuel ads. Again, this is based on the tobacco link. So tobacco advertising has been banned for more than 20 years. And we're just asking for something that's equivalent to that. And that's something that feels like it's gaining quite a bit of traction. We also worked with Caroline Lucas to put on a debate in Parliament about fossil fuels and political lobbying, which was the first debate of its kind. A lot of MPs spoke very positively about the need to reduce the influence of the fossil fuel industry over politics at that debate. Although it didn't lead to any material change in terms of the kind of policy side, it was a space to put more emphasis on this as an issue, and to hear that a lot of MPs do actually support this. I think they're just a bit frightened to take action on it when it's not the official line of their political party. We've also done quite a lot of calling out MPs for speaking at events that were sponsored by fossil fuel interests. So there's a tweet there from Alex Sobel, who was down to speak at a Politico Energy and Climate Summit, which was sponsored by Equinor, alongside 5 other MPs. We kicked up a big fuss about this, and 5 of the 6 MPs that were down to speak ended up pulling out of that event, which we counted as a big win, because it reduces Equinor's direct influence over them, but also it makes this a live issue. I think that's almost the more important thing, is showing that it's not okay to be doing that kind of thing and sort of de-normalizing it. So that's a big area of work. And then there's also the research side, which has been touched on, and Sally mentioned this bit of research we did about how often Labour ministers have met with fossil fuel lobbyists, and it turns out that is quite a lot, more than were happening with the Tories. So if anyone claims that things are better in this area because Labour is now in power, actually we've now got evidence showing that that is not the case, which is very useful. And again, this is an excuse to kick up a stink. So once we've got the numbers, then we're able to go to the press and turn it into a story. So I think, everyone knows that this is a problem, but you're not going to get the press coverage unless you've got a specific thing to talk about. So doing the research really helps with that as well. So lots of small wins along the way, which is really good to celebrate. But I think the main thing that we're kind of focusing on kind of as a long-term piece of work is trying to get MPs to sign up to something we're calling the Fossil Free Parliament Pledge. So I've just put the full wording on the slide there. So basically it's saying that as an MP, you pledge to support those 5 principles of the Fossil Free Parliament campaign. But there's, I suppose, a particular focus in the pledge on the financial interests, because that feels like the most obvious and direct one. So we've been, over the last couple of years, I think a year and a half or so, trying to get this pledge up and running. So far, 28 MPs have signed up to it. They're across a range of different political parties. So we've got Labour, SNP, Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid Cymru, SDLP. So most of the political parties do have someone who has signed up to this pledge, which I think is really positive. It's maybe worth noting that there's only one MP who's based in Scotland who has signed the pledge, who's Dave Dugan. So thanks, Dave. But there's quite a lot more people to try and reach. So I think, the campaign is working across the whole of the UK, and maybe we're a bit lacking in our Scottish wing at the moment. So there's more work to do in that area. So I think this is the long-term piece of work we're doing, which is just trying to build this group of supportive MPs who signed the pledge, who we can then ask to do things internally, who we have contact with, who will speak out on behalf of the campaign. So you can see Richard Bergen in the middle there, who did an early day motion about trying to put in place regulation around preventing fossil fuel donations, which was a useful start to the debate, although there's still a long way to go. So I think the main thing that I'd ask you to do here is to speak to your MP about this. We've got a tool set up on our website, and there's a QR code there which takes you to the sign up page to join our mailing list as well. There's all sorts of useful stuff that we provide to try and make it as easy as possible to contact your MP. So we provide template emails that you can customize. We provide advice on ways to find out about the things your MP is already doing and how to sort of tailor it to their interests. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is join the campaign. We are a volunteer group. We're based all around the UK, so anyone can join. All the organising tends to happen online. We have Zoom calls. We do things through shared documents and so on. So it's quite easy to get involved with, even if you have only little bits of time to fit it around other stuff. And we always need more people. We desperately need more people all the time. There's never enough people to do all the things that we want to do, particularly when it comes to doing big chunks of research like that one about the Labour Party meetings, which is very time consuming. So yeah, do join us, join the campaign, write to your MP and get involved in trying to build a fossil-free parliament. Thanks a lot.
Wait, okay. Turn that one off, turn this one on. So we're going to do some Q&A now. If anyone has any questions for the panel, we have like about 20 minutes. So any questions? Kyle at the back has a roving mic. So hands up. We got a question here, Kyle, and one over here. So just 1 second, there's a microphone there. I'm trying to get it turned on or not. I think the people online won't be able to hear you if we don't have the mic. So just 1 second. This gentleman here, Kyle. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that last presentation from Lewis. Thank you. All the presentations are great, but that almost the final thing you said triggered me. With the fossil-free Parliament pledge, and at the moment we've got 20-something people that have signed it from different parties. So that's cool to know. I can see the value of that. But watching the news and the polls and the predictions that Reform UK are likely to win the next election, which could be in, whatever, 3-4 years' time or something, that would seriously impact, because they unashamedly and overtly are climate deniers. So then and all the time when I'm listening to these presentations, I'm thinking, how does this dynamic between the corporations and the politicians feed into public opinion? And so, that's public opinion is what will produce the next Parliament and the number of Reform UK people. I'm not asking for an answer here. I don't have any answers myself, but I can't, I think that, we've been talking about 2 legs of the stool, but not the third one, which is public opinion. And how is that impacted by this dynamic, and how, particularly the politicians and the corporations, how are they influenced by public opinion?
Yeah, thank you. Anyone want to go first? Yeah.
So first, yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. Yeah, it's really, really scary, the situation with reform. And I think that adds an extra urgency to this work, where if we're not able to put in some kind of regulations that limit those fossil fuel industry interests before the next election, then I think that's going to really change things. Because yeah, they're a fossil fueled party essentially. So I am very, very worried about that. And I think that is increasingly affecting our interaction with politicians and so on. I think on the public opinion thing, I suppose I feel like we are public opinion, like we are the public, and we show how we feel about these things through campaigning and activism and trying to reach those decision makers. So yeah, I suppose that's how I feel as a member of the public, that I'm not happy with this situation. I want to do something about it. So that's why I joined the campaign. Maybe that's all I have to say about it. Like, I feel like as a campaign, we're not trying to influence the public because we are part of the public. Don't know if there's anything to say about that.
I was just going to answer from the perspective of a journalist, because that's the kind of viewpoint I have. And I think that our industry has got a lot of work to do. And, Reform have used opposition to climate policy and the transition as a massive rallying tool, I think, particularly in Scotland. I think that is one of their key recruiting positions. And the media in Scotland just hasn't done enough to challenge some of the narratives that are coming out of reform around the transition and the impact of the transition on jobs and people's bills. There's so much that is just misinformation coming out of reform, and we just need to get a lot better at pushing back on that. And I think, we're seeing a little bit of that more in the immigration space, but in climate policy, and I just don't think that our media is currently set up in a way that can challenge a lot of these things, and just doesn't have the expertise to do that. So it's thinking about how we can help to educate journalists so that they have the capacity to push back on some of these talking points when reform come up with them, because frankly, some of them are just ludicrous. So yeah, I suppose that would be my input. Don't know if you want.
Very quickly. So yeah, I think picking up on the misinformation and disinformation point, I think that's a really gigantic but important topic. And I think we all, as NGOs, campaigners, the public, journalists, need to get a better handle on how we counter mis and disinformation. And then I think what I've started to call distorted issue salience, and you mentioned immigration, and I think we see that in trans rights, and we see that in some of the way that reform talk about climate policy as well. And I think it's scary, but I think we just need to, it is a distortion, right? The public are generally supportive of these issues. It's just a loud minority, which we've always seen. And then to go back to the comparison to the tobacco industry, I guess banning smoking, everyone was always like, oh, we can't do that, that's terrible. And you can see reform would definitely not have liked to ban smoking, right? So, I think as Lewis says, like getting those structures in place before, while the sun is shining, she says, even though the sun isn't, well, it's only mildly cloudy instead of like a hurricane, I think is really important. But yeah, I mean, I did have something more positive to say, and I didn't write it down, and I've forgotten what it was. Sorry. If it comes back to me, I'll share it.
Thanks. We get a question here and a question here. I'll take them both at the same time, and then we'll try and speed things up a little bit.
Sorry, yeah. I had a very similar question, actually. I felt it was a glaring omission that no one this evening had mentioned public opinion. And if you look at opinion polls, there is a fairly consistent large majority of members of the public who believe we ought to be doing more about climate change. And yet, if you look at what the political parties are doing, they're all rushing in the opposite direction as fast as they can. The Conservative, well, Reform, obviously, the Conservatives and even Labour Party is going in the other direction pretty fast. And so, one should be trying to tap in, surely, to the what the public opinion polls are telling us, and trying to demonstrate to the political parties that they are going in the wrong direction.
Thanks. And we'll hear this question as well, and then we'll answer those.
Hi, I'm Q Manavan. I'm one of the lead candidates for the Scottish Greens, actually, for the Holyrood election. And I think I wanted to also just speak not as a candidate, but also just as a person, because it's been less than a year now that I've been in active politics, even less than that I've been with the Greens. So my party allegiance, at the very least, is only as long as the right things are done. And as a trans person, as an environmentalist who's worked with local campaigns groups in India and Ireland and now in Scotland, I joined the political space because of the rise of spaces like Reform, knowing that the only alternative to lobbying in spaces like that is to have voices that will listen to you. Most often the kinds of people who are in conferences of parties are people who've already developed relationships with them, not simply people who are seeking to develop relationships with them. And the same goes to any other spaces that we're in. But I found an active almost hesitation or difficulty in being able to reach the same groups that I was able to reach without the political affiliation that I had as an academic, as an expert, as an environmentalist, But now, whilst we're in these spaces trying to actively counter groups like Reform and lobby for environmentalist and fossil-free, against fossil-free work in Holyrood, for instance. So what are some of the ways in which I, as a person, as a candidate, can seek to possibly regain that trust, not only in people, but also in organizations that will happily provide local and grassroots support to the kinds of work that you're doing? Because it's kind of difficult to find the ability to win an election or to find representation or to accept lobbying that, you know, that is environmentalist, unless you have that kind of support, the kind that for which the right wing is not shy of, but the left still somewhat seems to be.
Thanks. This was one thing, firstly, to say about, you're right, of course, that people want climate policies. I mean, we see that consistently in polling, and we see the parties moving away from it. And there was some research from the University of Glasgow recently about Labour's vote share. Labour are losing votes to the Lib Dems and the Greens. Reform are gaining votes from the Conservatives and from new voters, but yet Labour are continuing to chase Reform voters as if that is where their votes are going, and it's not. So we spend a lot of time talking about that and being like, essentially like, why are you doing this? People want climate action. I think these two questions actually tie quite neatly together to me, in that what we see is that people do want climate action, but the cost of living and other pressures mean that while they want it, they have other concerns. If they think something can bring down the cost of their electricity bill or the cost of milk and eggs, then they're looking for that. Now we know that the solution to the cost of living crisis is the same as the solution to the climate crisis. I suppose we need to get better at communicating that and making it clear, and that will also hopefully open us up to more of these grassroots groups and allow us into these spaces to talk to people and say that the climate crisis is the solution to these problems and is a space for us to make our lives better in many different ways. I don't know if any of you want to add anything.
So I have two positive things to say. So I remember my first positive thing, and I have another positive thing. So my first positive thing was both on public opinion and party politics and avoiding leaning into the Reform rhetoric. I also keep an eye on Wales as part of my job, because Scotland isn't enough, right? So the Caerphilly by-election last week, right, which hit all of the major news headlines, and it was billed as a straight-up battle between Reform and Plaid, and Reform were winning in the polls, and Plaid really, they won, and they won convincingly. And one of the reasons they won convincingly was they had a really good grassroots ground campaign that offered a positive alternative. They weren't just anti-reform, they had very positive messages for the people of Wales, and including on things like environmental activism and climate activism. So I think that's a really positive story, and that we can think about how progressive parties could learn from that example. And then very quickly on how do you possibly stand up in the face of what is, let's face it, well, 3 probably billionaire funded political parties in the UK. And that does bring me back very quickly to the work that TI UK are trying to do to limit political donations. So yeah, keep an eye on that, because the more sort of different voices we can get, not just anti-corruption voices, talking about how important it is to limit donations to political parties, because it does just, it makes it such an uneven playing field. And yeah, Reform aren't just an oil-based party, they're a billionaire-based party. It's bizarre, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think the point about public opinion is really important. And I think that's why I sort of very strongly feel that through things like Fossil Free Parliament, we as members of the public need to get into those political spaces, because public opinion isn't the problem. Like, you can see that public opinion in terms of support for action on climate change is still really strong. And yet political decision makers keep making decisions against those interests. And you can see how Keir Starmer's stance on climate change before he came into government seems to have changed markedly to where we are now, where he's now talking about doubling down on oil and gas. And you can see all the meetings that he's had with fossil fuel industry interests during that period. And you can't help but think, well, this has affected his decision somehow. So I think just we as members of the public need to try and get into those spaces more and kind of question what's happening there, and problematize it, because there is this really distorting influence happening from a very small group of people that doesn't reflect the interests of most of us. And I think what most of us can do is try and make a problem of that, show that it's a problem, and try and bring it out of the shadows a bit, because I think it is a big issue, but it's caused by quite a small number of people compared to most of us.
I'm worried I'm going to come in and say something negative, which will bring the tone down a little bit. But no, I wanted to touch on your point about public opinion. And I think it's really interesting. I was listening to something earlier on about, it's so true that public opinion is on the side of climate action. Like in America, where obviously there's this huge rollback of anything green, they're actually hiding information about climate change because they know it's popular. So they're just trying to avoid talking about it. So it is just for us to try and make sure it's still a really salient issue. And I think there is a problem that it maybe has fallen down the agenda a little bit in the last couple of years, with other issues kind of rising up in terms of like the cost of living. Immigration is obviously a big one in the UK at the moment. So it's just about making sure we're making as much noise as possible about it, because it still is one of the most important issues of our time. And when people are actually presented with the facts about it, they're very receptive, and also the solutions are popular. So it's just about making sure that it's still in the debate.
We have some questions online. Like Rosie can read one or two for us, and then we'll probably have to finish there.
Hello, yes. So I have a kind of broad question from Chris online, which says, renewable energy hasn't been mentioned as much tonight. Does anyone have any reflections? Maybe you could take that to mean kind of quote unquote lobbying by the renewables industry. I suppose I'd draw out one point that a lot of the fossil fuel companies are also the ones that have piecemeal renewables portfolios, so it's quite hard to disentangle them. But yeah, feel free to reflect on that in any way that you'd like. And then we have a question from Penny, who has talked about the kind of more progressive parties having less media exposure, or progressive policies having kind of less media exposure. So how can we get more media attention for parties, or you could take that to mean broader than that, for those who are basically ignored? So those are two questions from the online participants.
Yeah, I'll just comment on the renewables point, because that's something we've been doing a lot of work on. We're doing a big project on the just transition, and I'm not sure if people in this room are aware, but there's quite a lot of opposition in the moment, and particularly in the Highlands and Islands, towards particularly onshore wind and developments around there. Just feeling that there's a lack of local democracy, and one element that we've seen recently is lobbying on basically what share of that energy communities get. And we got an FOI back today which showed that there was a huge lobbying effort against a measure that Highland Council tried to bring in called the Highland Social Value Charter, with basically all the renewables companies coming in and saying that that was going to basically mean that renewables projects weren't viable in Scotland. And I think, this is the other side of the coin, right? It's, if we want the transition and the move away from fossil fuels to be popular, we need to make sure it's being done differently from how oil and gas has been done, and that the benefits of it are being shared widely. And I think we really need to kind of focus on lobbying from that side as well, because if we can show that it can be done differently and that the shares can be, or the spoils can be shared a bit more widely, then I think that is only going to help us when we're trying to make the case for the phase out of fossil fuels. So I think it is a really important point to touch on, slightly different from what we've been discussing tonight, but it is the other side of the coin, definitely.
Juliet or Lewis, anything you want to add?
I mean, I guess that, so full confession, like I used to work in environmental NGOs a long time ago, and we were having very similar conversations. So I guess negatively, you could say, oh, we haven't achieved anything. But I think positively, it's like, how much worse would it be if we weren't the ones speaking out, and we weren't the ones standing up, and we weren't the ones campaigning for change? So I think just keep fighting, I guess, which is an entirely non-Transparency International hat comment to say. But there we go.
You got anything, Liz? Yeah. No. Well, thanks everybody. I think that's kind of going to be us at time now.
Would Rose, with 5 minutes to go, would Rose be able to come in on the renewables questions online?
Yeah, go for it.
Give us just 2 seconds there. Sorry, a bit of.
Hello?
Go for it. Yep.
Hello. Okay, we're having some muting, unmuting issues. Yeah, just on the renewers, it was quite an open question. So Juliet mentioned that when we were looking at climate lobbying at Westminster in Scotland, we also looked at the narratives being used by fossil fuel companies. And what we found that was quite surprising is a lot of these meetings were described as about renewables. We started to question why that was. And it's potentially because it's a bit of a cover. Because if they're having a meeting about renewables as BP, I wonder if that's really all they're talking about, or if that's just what they put as the description of the meeting. And even if they are discussing renewables, you know, as Rosie said, it's like a small part of what they do. I think it's quite similar, and we've made this point before about it's quite similar to maybe like an alcohol company, and they have like, they advertise like an alcohol-free beer. But at the end of the day, what you have as front of mind is the company. It's like the Heinz company, so not Heinz, Heineken company. And so I think that's maybe similar to what's going on here, is that whilst they might discuss renewables, it might be the pretense of the meeting, they're trying to get their companies, you know, front and centre, front of mind to the ministers that they're having the meetings with.
Thanks, Rose. And yeah, I think we'll wrap up there. Thanks everybody for coming. We're able to do events like this because of our members. FOS is a member-led organization. So if anyone is interested in joining, there's more information at the back. You can talk to any of us, and you can join right now for only £1 a month. Please contact your MPs about fossil-free Parliament. The next national meeting for us will be on the 26th of November, and it'll be about getting more involved in Friends of the Earth Scotland and our new campaigns. And on the 15th of November, there'll be COP30. You'll probably remember COP26 happened a few years ago in Glasgow. COP30 is coming up, and on the 15th of November, there'll be a climate march in Glasgow. Loads of different NGOs are going to be there, loads and loads of people. There's flyers on the table. Please come along. Please take the flyers and please take information at the back. And thank you, everybody. Thanks. And thanks to our speakers.
I know. You get your nature.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That was great.